Okay, yes, okay, great, all right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. My name is Edina Ostreicher. I'm the executive director for UConn Hilla. I'm also a UConn alum, so excited to be here tonight. I am really honored to introduce our guest speaker, and so happy that you took time to come out tonight. I know you got a lot going on with work and exams and everything, but I really appreciate your being here. This event tonight is co-sponsored through the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, our fraternity, alumni fraternity brothers of Phi Sigma Delta fraternity, one of whom is here in the back, Hal and his wife Anita, graduates of UConn from back in the 60s and 70s who have helped support it. Funding for a variety of programs to provide education for students around combating hatred and anti-Semitism. And then lastly, UConn Hilla, the Center for Jewish Student Life here at UConn. So happy to be here and really grateful to have you here. Arno Michaelis, all right, from Wisconsin. He has an incredibly compelling story. I met him virtually over the summer. We had several conversations throughout the summer, and really excited to have him here. He is a storyteller first and foremost, and is going to share his stories tonight of how compassion, love, forgiveness helped transform him from a white nationalist to a peacemaker, an entrepreneur, an author of My Life After Hate, so many other things, member of the Forgiveness Project, but first and foremost considers himself a storyteller and so share some amazing stories with us this evening. So please, round of applause for Arno. AC in here. I know it's really like an ice box.
It's warmed up.
Yeah.
From where it was. We're making progress. I'm going to start out with a video that's going to cover a lot of ground in the stories so that we can spend more time in conversation.
Beautiful serene morning. Had the windows down, thinking to myself, like literally thinking to myself, this is a beautiful morning. Life seemed like it was destroyed. I start to see squad cars flying by us. The squad car pulls up in front of us. I start to see squad cars flying by us. The squad car pulls up in front of us, like takes it off real quick. I asked the police officer, like, sir, what's going on? And he's like, son, there's a shooting that happened at the temple.
Police say the shooting began around 10:30 Sunday morning as many inside the Sikh temple were gathering for worship. Witnesses said the first shots came outside, inside mayhem.
I felt anger. But then I felt this sense of relief that like I wasn't involved in that. I also felt this incredible sense of guilt. For the past 5.5 years, I've continued to wrestle with those two feelings, survivor's guilt and survivor's relief. I am just appreciative to live this life, but I also have this guilt of I'm not doing enough.
You guys all hear that? When we breathe in suffering and we breathe out healing.
Serve to Unite was founded in response to the August 5th, 2012 Sikh temple shooting. It was a means for the Sikh community to transform this atrocity into something inspirational that would bring people together from that day forward.
It was initially formed to bring about an awareness of the Sikh community, but then we knew that it was going to morph into something much bigger than that to really address communal healing for all communities.
Today, Serve to Unite works with young people from 2nd grade through college. We do arts-driven service learning and global engagement. We also organize a 6K run every year to raise money for scholarships for 6 young people in honor of the 6 victims of the Sikh temple shooting. And recently, Pardeep and I have started working with small towns and municipalities, trying to help them become comfortable with demographic change as populations are changing.
We're weaving in our parts of ourselves into a map of Milwaukee to end the segregation, to bring everybody together.
There's places where people are just not as unified, and if we have a chance to change that, we should definitely do it. Especially with Milwaukee being like that, we should do as much as we can.
So this is the bullet hole that was left by the shooter as he was trying to shoot into the women that were here. He was just shooting from back here. And then Dad's final resting place was in this room, as was the other priest who was working. And he gets out here, and as these responding officers are coming to the scene, they engage in a firefight with Wade Page. And Wade Page takes his own life. The shooter killed himself. There was not much explanation from law enforcement, so I said, let me reach out to Arnold and really find out why white supremacists do these things. In a selfish kind of way, I also wanted someone to raise their hand and say, you know what, I'm responsible for this.
In 1987, me and a few friends of mine started a white power skinhead gang in Milwaukee. We started our own white power skinhead band also. And our band was very much a rallying point for like every pissed off white kid in Wisconsin.
We must secure the existence of our race and the future of white children.
We stoked their anger and their angst, and we blamed it on Jewish people, we blamed it on people of color, we blamed it on gay people. We later got involved in the early stages of what today is known as Hammerskin Nation, and that's the largest organized white power skinhead group on the planet Earth. So nowadays, when violence is perpetrated by this group, I feel a great deal of responsibility. And speaking of which, Wade Michael Page, the man who murdered Pardeep's father and 5 other people, was a member of that group. Basically brought about an inner conversation where I'm saying, where do you get off thinking that you're gonna go waltzing off into the sunset after all of the people you hurt, after all of the harm you've done? I left the movement in 1994. On paper, we couldn't have been more different, but when we sat down and talked, we saw how much we had in common, and it hit us at that point, like, we need to work together. We gotta do something together to basically get this message out to the world, and the more people we can help understand this, the better off we're all gonna be.
Oh yeah, the murals. We had a group of people who painted murals on the walls in our school, and they had positive messages and things to bring the community together. We've also been doing art. We like to connect art.
People of the high school age, that they're the next generation. So it's important to me for them to have a good community for themselves, which will bring a better community for the younger generation and for generations to come.
If we're gonna be the antidote for what's wrong with our society, we really gotta focus on what's right. In my experience, what's right is the truth that human beings have more in common than different.
The more voids that a child has, the more vulnerabilities. So filling those voids with sort of wraparound programming, it takes a village to raise a child. And somehow, some way, we step back from that saying. But I think that saying is more true now than ever. It takes a village to really nurture a child.
To have amazing people in my life like Pardeep Kalika, who have taught me so much and who love me and I love them. Pretty much every day I am literally in this state of joy and gratitude. That's what life's all about.
Kind of surreal and eye-opening to see the way our society responds to these mass shootings, mass murder, hate crimes.
that tragically have only picked up since August 5th, 2012. When the Sikh temple shooting happened, at the time, it was the worst attack committed by an affiliated white nationalist since 1963, when members of the Ku Klux Klan set a bomb intended for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that ended up killing 4 little girls in Birmingham, Alabama. Since August 5th, 2012, I think we all know, there's been attack after attack after attack. They become more and more deadly. Everything that Pardeep and I do together is meant to create a world where the kind of hatred behind these attacks is not normalized, and that hatred is actually dispelled. When people connect and see themselves in others and see others in themselves, it's an inoculation against that kind of hatred. It's the antidote to the disease of really separatism that happens when we don't see ourselves in others, when we see ourselves as something apart from our fellow human beings. At the 10-year anniversary vigil, we had about 600 people gather at the Gurdwara in Oak Creek. And again, it's surreal, it's disturbing, it's interesting to see like how this protocol happens. Nowadays, mass shootings are tragically so common that we're like, okay, who was it this time? Where did it happen? How many people? Where's the vigil? And then the first year there's a big vigil, and the first anniversary, maybe there's another big vigil. And then the second year, there's fewer people at that vigil. The third year, fewer people still. That's what happened in Oak Creek. At the 10-year vigil, there's a ton of people there. Among them, Pardeep's daughter, Amaris, who absolutely stole the show. Amaris was 6 years old when her grandpa was killed by Wade Michael Page. Her younger brother, Jay, was 4. Since then, they've had 2 younger brothers born who never met their grandpa. And at this 10-year vigil, Pardeep was emceeing it. And if you guys know Pardeep like I know him, he's one of the most like down-to-earth, mellow guys, like also the keep it together guy. I'm usually the one who loses it and starts crying, and Pardeep will come and like give me a hug and keep me together. But at this vigil, as Pardeep was announcing his daughter to come up and do a spoken word piece that she had written about the August 5th attack, he was losing it. You could tell he's like, baby girl, come up here and rescue your dad. And she came up there and she read this piece she had written that was just absolutely stunning. And it was directed at Wade Michael Page, as if she was talking right to him. And I'm not a good enough speaker to even try to recreate the genius that she laid down that night. But her one line that stuck with me and brought tears to my eyes as she was talking to Wade Michael Page, the shooter who took his own life in the aftermath of that shooting. Amaris said to him, "I'm not your enemy, you are." That summed up my story. Looking back at the years I spent doing harm to society, doing harm to innocent people, thinking that everyone else was my enemy, thinking everything wrong in my life was everyone else's fault but mine. The truth of it was, I was my own worst enemy. I was the one who made the very poor decisions that put me in that place. Today I work in a field loosely called counter-violent extremism, sometimes prevention of violent extremism. It's basically working with NGOs, working with law enforcement, with governments, with civil society people, trying to prevent violent extremism of all sorts. I've been doing this for 13 years, and I've worked with a lot of what we call formers in that space. I'm a former, as in a former violent extremist. I have a lot of friends who are also former white nationalists. We all work together now to prevent white nationalism, to get people out of those groups, to create more formers. I have a lot of friends who are from other genres of violent extremism. One of my dear friends is a man named Mubin Sheikh, who describes himself as a former Muslim supremacist. And Mubin and I have done a lot of talks together, actually, and I recall one where someone asked me to talk about what the role of anti-Semitism was in white nationalism. And it's interesting, and I think very important for anyone concerned about racism and hate in our society. It's very important to understand that racism and anti-Semitism are like this. They almost always co-present. I have never met a racist who wasn't also an anti-Semite. I have never met an anti-Semite who wasn't also a racist. Those two flavors of hatred are very complementary and they always co-present. So at this conference, Mubin and I are up there, we're talking about the kind of differences between white supremacists and, as Mubin puts it, Muslim supremacists. And somebody asked, well, so what did you guys think about Jews? As a white nationalist, I believed that there was a Jewish conspiracy to kill all of the white people on the planet Earth. And it had been going on for thousands of years, and it was still in full swing. And I also believe that if I, as a white man, didn't fight back against this conspiracy, that my people would be exterminated. I hope that sounds ridiculous to everyone in this room, because it is ridiculous. But I had myself convinced of that. And as I'm describing the role of anti-Semitism to this group that was actually law enforcement, somebody said, okay, Mubin, what was the Muslim supremacist take on anti-Semitism? And Mubin's like, what he just said. You just swap out white race with Muslims, and that was the way they looked at Jews. Anti-Semitism is far and away the oldest, longest running hatred that human beings have inflicted upon ourselves in human history. And it's not exclusive to white nationalists to hate Jewish people and to blame everything wrong in their lives on them. Mubin and his former crew did the exact same thing. The so-called Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, they all have a very similar ideology of us versus them. And it all involves blaming what's going wrong in their lives on Jewish people. Now, if I look back at my childhood, and a lot of what I do nowadays is like Monday morning psychoanalysis. I'm like trying to look back on my childhood and be like, what the hell went wrong? What mistakes did I make that led me to a point where I was ready to attack people because of the color of their skin? Or attack people because I thought they were gay? Or attack people just because I was drunk and they were in the wrong place at the wrong time? And you might imagine, if you hear of somebody in such a state, that they had a really horrific childhood. And knowing all the formers I do, it's not an uncommon story. In mental health terms, they call it ACE, or an adverse childhood experience, as a point of trauma that drives that kind of violence. My childhood, by comparison, was relatively idyllic. I grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood, a well-to-do suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin called Mequon. My parents were together. They loved me very much. They let me know that at every turn. In fact, all the adults in my life when I was a little kid were just like, he's so wonderful. He's so gifted. He can do anything. Like, I was this golden boy that everybody fawned upon. I wasn't beaten. I never went hungry. I didn't have any of the classic Hallmark ACEs that you would expect to see. But as is often the case, while things might look cool on the surface, underneath there's things happening that we're not aware of. And in my case, it was my father's alcoholism. Now, again, when I say my father wasn't drunk, people are like, oh, he must have whooped his ass, he must have beat him, he must have beat mom. And that wasn't the case either. My dad wasn't a mean drunk.
My dad was a fun drunk. When my dad was drunk, we were gonna shoot guns and light off fireworks. And that was fun for a little boy. When I do talks with parties, I was like, bro, that's not normal. Most people don't shoot guns and fireworks when their dad's drunk. That's not what happens. In my life, it was normal. We had a pistol range in our basement. And when my mom was like trying to get some sleep after working 2 jobs to keep the lights on and the bills paid in her nice house in a nice neighborhood, because my dad was too busy partying, we'd be in the basement shooting Colt 45s, 9mm. It wasn't fun for my mom. And that was my pain point. As I look back in my childhood, that Monday morning psychoanalysis, and I'm like, what went wrong? What I'm putting my finger on is that my mother's suffering was my suffering. And even though my dad wasn't abusive to me or my brother, his relationship with my mom sucked. They fought constantly. We were living way beyond our means. They were constantly borrowing money, having their parents bail them out, pay their mortgage. The stress between my mom and dad made my mom miserable. And throughout my childhood, I felt like my mom was literally at the end of her rope. In 2010, my Aunt Jerry killed herself. And when my mom and I were talking about it, talking about suicide, which I'm fairly familiar with, I attempted suicide twice during my 7-year involvement in white nationalism. My mom just said, yeah, I was suicidal throughout your childhood. And if it wasn't for you and your brother, I would have killed myself. And I wasn't surprised to hear that. I knew she was that miserable growing up. And rather than be a good kid and be like, hey, Mom, I'm sorry you're having a hard time. I love you. How can I help? Like, I wish I would have done that, but I didn't do that. Instead of doing that, I just distanced myself from my mom. And I distanced myself from my dad, who, despite his disease, loved me very much. And of course, as I'm distancing myself from the people who love me, it made my suffering worse. Now, there's a very profound truth that I refer to on a daily basis. And this truth is actually a tool that you can use in your life on a daily basis as well. It's 4 words, 2 of which are the same: hurt people, hurt people. I believe that all violence in this world, whether it's a nasty comment on Instagram, it's a fight in the schoolyard, it's a hate crime attack, even to world wars, I believe that violence stems from suffering. If a human being isn't suffering, they have no reason to hurt somebody. They have no reason to hate someone. And quite often we go, well, that person's not suffering. They got everything they need. They're in a position where they're in a position of privilege. What are they suffering about? We don't know what's going on underneath that surface. The same way most people wouldn't have known what was going on looking at my childhood. Because I was hurting, I started lashing out at other kids. I was a bully on the school bus in kindergarten. I started to get a kick out of it. It was like a rush to cause trouble at school, to have parents and teachers and principals tearing their hair out, going, what the hell's wrong with this kid? It became like an addiction. I'm very familiar with addiction because I'm an alcoholic myself. I drank profusely from the age of 14 until 34. When I started drinking at age 14, I think I had like 4 or 5 beers and I passed out. When I quit drinking at age 34, my magic number was 18 beers. That was how many beers I could drink and still function the next day, still go to work. And it's an illustration of the nature of substance abuse. What gets you high that first time doesn't get you high 10 times later. So you have to keep escalating the amount of substance you take in to get the same kind of buzz. That's how my antisocial behavior as a kid went. After a while, it got boring just being a bully on the school bus. So I'd get the whole school bus to beat this kid up instead of me just beating him up. When that got boring, I'd get fights in the schoolyard. 6th grade, I started breaking and entering, committing acts of vandalism. Started drinking myself when I'm 14. The alcohol was absolutely gas on a fire to my antisocial behavior. By the time I'm 16, I am a full-blown alcoholic. I've been hateful and violence when I was a little kid. And hate was actually just more of the thrill. It was a thrill for me to be like, I hate my parents, and I hate this school, and I hate this society, and I hate cops, and I hate the government. It was a rush. It created that same kind of rush I got from being a bully on the school bus. That's who I was when I was exposed to white nationalist ideology through white power skinhead music. Now, prior to being a skinhead, I was a punk rocker. I still love punk rock. I don't want to make it sound like punk is some kind of gateway drug to becoming a white power skinhead. There's a lot of cool things about punk, then as now. A belief of questioning authority, of not conforming, of doing things yourself. I think all those things are admirable. But to me, punk was just about breaking shit. Punk was just about pissing people off. That's what attracted me to it. Back in the late 80s, in my punker days, a mohawk hairdo was very unsightly. You would never see that walking down the street. And in fact, I had a mohawk just because it repulsed people. It was a reliable way to get in a fight walking down the street with a mohawk in 1986. Nowadays, mohawks are pretty passé. Basketball players got mohawks, dude on the chocolate chip cookie commercials got a mohawk. It's not even a big deal anymore. But back then, it was a big deal. It shocked people. That's what attracted me to it. Well, if you think a mohawk shocks people, try a swastika. Swastikas really shock people. And I wasn't ignorant as to why. I knew about the Holocaust. I didn't have anything against Jewish people. The suburb I lived in, there was a ton of Jews over there. I went to all sorts of bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs in 6th grade. I had a dear friend of mine I grew up with named Dean Kaplan. We were in a Cub Scout thing together. Him and his dad, Stan, and my dad used to sit around drinking scotch. Pretty sure Stan came by us shooting a couple times, actually. But all I cared about was that repulsion that the swastika caused. And looking back, I think that was because I had never processed the trauma that I experienced as a kid watching my mother suffer. Now, is that an excuse for what I did? Absolutely not. I don't think there's ever an excuse to hate people or an excuse to hurt people. But there's always a reason. And that reason doesn't have to make sense. It just needs to be understood. If we're going to derail young people from getting to a place where they're ready to shoot up a place of worship, we don't excuse their violence by any means, but we need to understand where it comes from. As I mentioned in the video, as soon as we started this White Power Skinhead gang, the first thing I did was start a White Power Skinhead band. I've been screaming in punk bands for a couple of years prior to that. I don't have a lick of musical talent, didn't then, don't now, but I was really good at screaming loud. I can't scream like that nowadays because I get a migraine. But back in the day, I was all about it. I didn't have a problem being on stage and making a fool out of myself, getting people crazy. So when I got my buddy who played guitar together and my buddy who played drums together, we found a bass player, we had our own White Power Skinhead band. We had our own vector for this toxic ideology that had infected us via music. Now it's interesting to look at how society has changed since then. I'm of a rare and unique generation of people who grew up without the internet and are currently used it. So about half my life, there was no such thing as an internet. Now I depend on it just as much as anybody else. But back then, prior to social media, prior to Instagram, prior to email and all these things, these toxic ideas had to spread person to person. So music was actually a really important way to spread that ideology. Not only to spread it, but also to practice it. The same way if you want to learn how to speak Spanish and you listen to a how to speak Spanish recording every night when you go to sleep, you're going to kind of like drill Spanish words in your head. You're going to pick up some through osmosis. It's going to help you actually speak a different language at some point. If you listen to music every day that tells you you need to kill people who don't look like you, you're practicing that ideology of hate and violence. It's a way to maintain that elevated sense of hostility required to think that way and to act that way. So as my friends and I were radiating hate and violence out into the world reflected it back to us. Now, in addition to being a former white nationalist, I'm also a former information technology consultant. I'm not going to talk too much about that time in my life because it's just too traumatic. You're an IT guy, you get that joke. But I mention IT because when we are talking about our phones or we're talking about a computer, there's systems that work according to input and output. If I pick up my phone and I open up a web browser and I input a URL, I want to go to NHL.com, check a hockey score, that's the input. The output that the web browser gives me is the score I'm looking for. Just as input and output dictate how computer systems work, it also dictates how our society works. When you are inputting hate and violence into society, nonstop, day in and day out, society is going to give you hate and violence back. And that's what happened to us. Within 6 months of starting this gang, my buddy Pat, who played guitar in our band, shot a kid who came to do a drive-by on our house. Within a year, another dear friend of mine who I shared a birthday with, he was exactly 1 year younger than me, was shot and killed in a street fight as he was out practicing hate and violence the way I taught him to. And rather than see these misfortunes that we brought upon ourselves as a wake-up call, which we would have done if we were a little smarter, we blamed all of these misfortunes that we brought upon ourselves on everybody but us. It wasn't Pat's fault he shot this kid. It was the Jews' fault. It wasn't my other friend's fault that he went out and picked a fight at a bar that ended up with him getting shot and killed. That wasn't everybody who doesn't look like us's fault. Now, when you practice irresponsibility like that, go figure, your life is going to tank. It's not going to go well. Nothing you try to do is going to go work out. You're not going to have a successful friendship with everyone. You're not going to have a successful romantic relationship with anyone. You're not going to be successful at work. You're not going to be successful in school. Nothing you do is going to work. And then guess what happens? Whose fault is it that nothing's working? It's actually your fault, but of course you blame everybody else. And everything continues to spiral downward. That's what led to my 2 suicide attempts during that 7-year stretch. Fortunately for me, both times I tried to commit suicide, I happened to be dating a skinhead girl who wasn't squeamish at the sight of blood and knew enough basic first aid to keep me from bleeding out. Both times I tried to slit my wrists. It's insidious to think of the hole that we dug for ourselves and continue to dig for ourselves until I became very lucky that the planets aligned and things fell into place and the right people at the right time came into my life to lead me to a better place. Now, I've been doing talks like this for going on 13 years. I've done hundreds and hundreds of talks with schools from kindergarten to Harvard to UConn, go Huskies. I've done talks at Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube. I've done talks in Washington, D.C. and in New Delhi and in Australia. And the most frequently asked question I get, and by the way, we're going to have some time for questions tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. If there's a question that comes to mind as I'm speaking, and you're like, ooh, I don't know if I should ask them that. Like, that's the question I want, actually. I love those kind of questions. I love tough questions. Nothing is off limits. I especially love questions I never got before, which is pretty rare. The longer I do this, the rarer it gets. But I know you guys are pretty brilliant, so maybe we'll have that tonight. But the most frequently asked question I get, I'm going to head off one of them, is what made you change? And the simple answer to that question is exhaustion. It's exhausting to live that way. It's exhausting to see all the human beings on this planet as your enemy. And when I say all the human beings, I mean all of them. As you guys can imagine, white nationalists have a big, long list of people that they hate. And everybody's on that list that you can imagine. Anybody who's not white, whatever that is. This idea of race has been around for 400 years and it's never been established who's white and who's not objectively, because it's just it's an ideology. But even people who look like me, if they didn't think like me, they were an enemy as well. In fact, we called any white people who weren't racist, we called them race traitors. Today, I'm very proud to be a race traitor. And I'm not ashamed to say I try to create more race traitors everywhere I go. We should all be race traitors. But white nationalists hate everyone. Every waking moment of your day, you're looking at enemies. And there's no factual evidence to justify thinking everyone's an enemy. This is all because of this ideology that we assumed as our identity. That was an exhausting position to be in. It was exhausting to do things that I knew were wrong, yet didn't have the inner courage to be accountable for. There were times as I was like hitting someone where I had an inner voice going, what the hell are you doing? What's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? You're a horrible person. And I didn't have the courage to even acknowledge that voice, much less answer it. So I'm constantly suppressing this knowledge of my inner wrongness. And that required a lot of energy. It was exhausting. It was exhausting to cut myself off from society and culture that I had taken for granted my entire life. I grew up a hardcore sports, music, TV, film geek. I loved all that stuff. And being from Wisconsin, I was a member of the statewide cult that we have that actually has reach all over the world. And the cult is called the Green Bay Packers. We wear like cheese on our heads. And I loved the Packers growing up. But as a white collar skinhead, I couldn't very well be like, hey guys, let's go watch the Packer game on Sunday. Because who's on the Packers? Bunch of black guys, bunch of white guys. And they don't only have to get along, like they gotta play as a unit if they want a prayer of winning a football game. So I couldn't enjoy a Packer game because doing so would make me a traitor to my people, complicit in the oppression of the white race at the hands of, guess who? The Jews. Now, again, I hope that sounds completely ridiculous to everybody in this room. It is completely ridiculous, but that was my reality as a white nationalist. It was exhausting having to sneak around on Sundays away from my buddies, going to my dismal, dingy little efficiency apartment, turning on my crappy little TV real low though, so no one could hear the Packer game going, and just be like, woo! It was ridiculous. It was stupid. I knew it was stupid. Yet I kept thinking and acting that way. That was exhausting. What was most exhausting though was when people I claimed to hate treated me with kindness. And I was incredibly fortunate that that happened time and time again throughout my 7-year involvement in white nationalism. There were people like a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, Afro-American and Latino coworkers who treated me with kindness when I least deserved it, but when I needed it most. Now, I don't know if I told you guys this, but I dropped out of high school after sophomore year because I'm a gifted genius. My mom says I'm a gifted genius, so you know it's true. And as a gifted genius, like what need do I have for high school? So I leave high school after sophomore year. My mom being a very practical person, and believe me, both my parents tried very hard to keep me in school. They had completely lost control of me at that point. My parents had never physically disciplined me my entire life. There's a lot of people hear my story now and they're like, you just need a good ass whooping, like you need it. I can't necessarily argue with that. I don't believe violence is a way to teach children anything or anybody else, but at the same time, maybe there could be a case that an ass whooping may have changed my direction here and there. But my dad never tried to physically discipline me until I was 14 years old, and then it was pretty too late because I was already bigger than him. So my parents had completely lost control of me. They're just in complete damage control mode at this point. And my mom is like, okay, if you're not going to go to school, and you're going to move out of the house into a dumpy house with a bunch of punk rockers, or you're going to drive out and replace the skinheads, you need to get a job. So she reached out to a high school friend of hers named Jack Cooper. He had a t-shirt printing business. She asked Jack to give me a job and he said, sure. So here I was, 16 years old, working 40 hours a week, third shift, printing t-shirts. And I thought I was very clever. I was making my own money. I was drinking beer. I was, thinking like I was an adult. But also every time I came to work, I was a very outspoken racist. I let everybody I worked with know about my racial views. All the Afro-American coworkers I had, I was always trying to like coax racial hatred out of them. All the Latino coworkers I had, my Asian coworkers, all the white coworkers I had, I'm always trying to recruit them into my cause. I had a shaved head. I typically had scars all over me and abrasions and whatnot, stitches. I had swastikas tattooed on me. And I wore a flight jacket with a big swastika patch on. Like there was no mistaking who I was. It wasn't like somebody would be like, oh, I didn't know he was a racist. Like, yeah, I was pretty much as obviously a racist as you can possibly imagine. It gets back to my mom that I'm doing this. She calls up Jack in tears because Jack's Jewish. He actually had family that perished in the Holocaust. And my mom called him up to say, look, I understand if you fire Arnie, I'd fire him if I were you. I wouldn't put up with this. And rather than fire me, Jack goes, he's a good kid. He's just going through a phase. And not only did he let me keep my job, he gave my asshole skinhead buddies jobs, selling the t-shirts that I printed. So here we are writing songs about how Jews are the scum of the earth and everything wrong with the world is their fault. When in real life, we have a means of supporting ourselves thanks to the good graces of a Jewish man. Reality is not jiving with this nonsense that we're trying to believe. And it's driven home by that kindness. When we get in situations where we're traumatized or when we're very passionate about an issue, it's very easy to be like, you know what, to hell with kindness. I'm done with kindness. Kindness hasn't gotten us anywhere. I've heard that many, many times. And I can understand how someone could feel that way. When you have generational trauma going back centuries. But the bottom line is kindness works. Kindness is a weapon. Compassion is a weapon. Kindness and compassion are what led me from white nationalism. Now, I know I'm a big gnarly dude. Some people are scared of me as I'm walking around. When I was this gnarly kid, I was fighting all the time. The thing is, like, I might be a big guy, but I'm very uncoordinated. I was never a very good fighter, never a very talented fighter. So I got my ass whooped absolutely as often as I beat anybody else up. And not once did violence make me any less hateful or violent. In fact, when I did get my ass whooped, it made me think I was all the more correct in my thinking. It made me justify this whole idea of I'm at war, and this is glorious that I'm coming home with stitches and my arm in a cast. It just made all the hate and violence seem all the more necessary. But when these very brave people put themselves in a position of power by dictating the rules of engagement to me, you guys may have heard that term rules of engagement, especially when people are talking about a military scenario. It's a good idea anytime you're in a conflict not to play by your opponent's rules. If you and I were going to go fight in a steel cage someday, and someone said, would you like to make the rules or would you like Arnold to make the rules? Which would you prefer?
I'd like to make the rules.
That would probably be a wise move. You could be like, well, spoiler alert, I have post-concussion syndrome now, so like if you look at me funny, I get a concussion, you win no matter who made the rules. But in general practice, it's not a good idea to let your opponent make the rules. When I was a skinhead, the rules I liked were hostility and violence and hate. So when people responded to my hostility with some of their own, I was just like, yes, thank you. Thank you. I win. I win. Whether I get beat up or not, if the rules are hostility and violence and hatred, I win. But when these brave people said, no, that's not how human beings should treat each other, allow me to demonstrate how a human being should treat another human being, that was power. They dictated the rules of engagement to me. And those acts of kindness drove home that exhaustion like nothing else did. It brought me to a point where I was looking for an excuse to leave. And I needed an excuse because I was leading a very drastic double existence. In the movement, as we called it, I was a big deal. I was the lead singer of this band that sold 20,000 records. We had groupies. We were like rock stars. I was a reverend in a self-declared racial holy war. I was one of the founding members of Hammersmith Nation. There were like kids in Germany sitting around getting drunk, talking about fights that I got into. I had this huge inflated persona that was all built out of smoke and mirrors, but it seemed pretty impressive as long as you didn't look behind the curtain. In real life, I'm an alcoholic high school dropout, too much of a drunk to pay his bills, has to keep moving back home to mom and dad's house, and he has a habit of drinking until he passes out and pissing all over himself. That's who I was in real life. And so to give up all of this and face the cold reality of this situation I had created for myself was an imposing idea. I needed something drastic to happen to shock me out of that. And what that was in 1994, my girlfriend, who was the mother of my daughter, who was 18 months old at that time, my girlfriend and I broke up. Go figure, but hate and violence and alcohol is not a recipe for a healthy relationship between a man and woman. And I found myself a single parent to our daughter. A couple months after that, after a concert my band had played, a second friend of mine was shot and killed in a street fight. By that point, I had lost count how many friends had been incarcerated. So I finally found the excuse I was looking for to turn my back on white nationalism in 1994. Being a man of extremes, I went from being a white nationalist neo-Nazi skinhead to being a raver. So here I am a couple of years away from when I would attack people because of the color of their skin. And I found myself on the south side of Chicago at 4 a.m. on Sunday, shaking my ass to house music with 3,000 people of every possible ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background you can imagine, and loving every minute of it. And I did that for another 7 years. That was a really amazing time for me. It was very formative. It helped me get to where I am today. There were people in the rave scene that accepted me and forgave me and embraced me, even when I still had swastikas tattooed on. That example is really a big driver of my work now. I still love house music. I still love techno. I'm a little too old to be staying up all night nowadays. My knees can't handle it. But that time in my life brought me to a point where I finally needed to quit drinking. I did that in 2004. I started writing in 2007. And in 2010 is when I went public with my story. By August of 2012, I had a couple of years of platform as like the former white nationalist guy. And that's where I was when that shooting that you guys saw in the video happened. A couple of months after the shooting, Party Singh Kalika, the other gentleman you saw in the video, reached out to me. Party's father, Satwant, was the last person killed that day. He died about as far away from I am to this window to a door that he could have run out of at any time. But he stayed and he fought the gunman with a butter knife. It was the only weapon he could find. And he fought until his last breath because the Gurdwara that morning was full of elderly people and children who were hiding in the basement, hiding in closets. Satwant's bravery bought enough time for the Oak Creek Police Department to arrive, and that's what it ultimately ended the situation. Party reached out to me and he wanted to know how someone could do this. What could bring somebody to the point where nothing but homicide followed by suicide seems to make sense? And he wanted to know what can we do about it as individuals and as a society? The answer to both questions is the same. Practice. When we practice something, we make it normal for us. When you practice hate and violence, and I don't think anybody sets out to practice hate and violence, like you set out to practice piano or drawing or writing. But when you adopt an ideology as your identity that says you are at war with all the other human beings on earth, and that the color of your skin makes you superior to other people and different than everyone else and at war with everyone else, you're practicing hate and violence. When hate and violence become normalized in our life, it makes you so miserable that nothing but homicide followed by suicide can make sense. That's how Wade Michael Page reached that point. He was radicalized in the United States Army in 1998, and by 2012, math frightens and confuses me, but that's 14 years he spent practicing hate and violence. That's why he ended up as he did. Now, as far as what we can do about it, the answer once again is practice. Practicing kindness, practicing compassion, becoming very familiar with those things so that they're as natural to us as breathing is. That's what puts us in a position to interrupt these cycles, to reach the next suffering, isolated individual out there on the verge of harming themselves and others. We need the type of kindness that can operate at those levels. We need practiced, adept kindness, like the very brave people who demonstrated kindness for me. They changed the course of my life to a point where I've now helped other people get out of white nationalist hate groups as well, by practicing kindness, by practicing compassion. And now the people that I've helped to change their lives are doing that professionally. Weaponizing kindness, weaponizing compassion, making it a practice. It's very easy to be nice to nice people. It feels great when everybody's nice. When we're little kids, we just want everybody to be nice to each other. I still want everybody to be nice to each other. And it can be done. But it's very difficult to be nice to assholes. There's all sorts of people out there that you don't want to spend any time and energy being nice to them. They're out here doing harm to people. They're out here hurting people. Who wants to be nice to them? I don't. Honestly, I don't. I wish I didn't have to deal with it. But the fact is, when we do demonstrate kindness for people who are trapped in those miserable situations, it has the power to divert them to a much better place. I'm incredibly honored to do that work today, and I'm incredibly honored to share my story with all of you guys. I'm very grateful to the time you spent listening to me tonight. In addition to kindness and compassion, listening is one of the greatest gifts we can give each other as human beings. So thank you for listening to me. Please don't be stingy listening to each other, listening to your family, your parents, your teachers. The more we all listen to each other, the more we all practice kindness and compassion, the better off we're all going to be, and the more able we'll be as a human society to face the immense challenges that we face here on the spaceship Earth that we all travel on. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And then if you're down to stick around, I do have a compassion workshop I'd love to get you all involved with. That'll take 20, 30 minutes or so. So thank you all.
Through Zoom. One is, since separating from white supremacists, has your life been threatened by your former focus?
That's another very frequently asked question. When I left, I was fortunate that our organization had really crumbled to the point where there wasn't anybody to come after me. As I mentioned, I do a lot of corporate stuff, and it's kind of a trend nowadays, which I think is a great trend, is businesses are being conscious about the impact of their business. And they're thinking about the purpose of their organization. And they want to attract employees who are into this purpose and doing good in the world. And that's awesome. I'm working with a business and we're talking about, let's create an organizational culture of kindness. What's that going to do for our customer service? What's that going to do for people being excited to come to work? It's going to be great. Your organizational culture shapes your organization and everything that it does. Well, our organizational culture back then was hate and violence. So go figure, we weren't the most functional organization. We fought each other as much as we fought anybody else. And what this meant was, is while our group peaked at about 150 warm bodies in southeastern Wisconsin, by the time I left, it was really just me, the guys in my band, and a couple of the other older guys. We were all getting burnt out. We all had like young families. We were all working like medium minimum wage jobs and struggling just to get by and trying to adult. And when I did leave, my guys, instead of coming after me violently, were like, well, we're the white race, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, come on, man. I'm done with it. And they were all pretty much like, watching me go, they were like, oh. Most of them followed soon after. So there really wasn't anybody to come after me when I left. When I did go public, when I started in 2010, I did start getting hate mail. I actually haven't got hate mail lately, and I feel like I'm slacking. Like I need to crank it up a little bit, make sure I'm getting that hate mail coming back from the haters, because I know when I get the hate mail from them, it means I struck a nerve. But it's the type of thing where there's a very fine line between foolish and fearless. And I've been kind of walking that line my whole life. I don't really know what side I'm on it at any given time. Maybe I should look over my shoulder more than I do. But at the same time, I'm not gonna let my time and energy be hijacked by threats when I got work to do. So yeah, I get threats sometimes. It's mostly from like keyboards and whatnot. It's not a big concern of mine. Yes.
So were you arrested for the attack that happened in 2012?
No, I was one. Oh,
I'm referring to the shooting of the.
Right.
Yeah.
So I left hate groups in 1994, and that attack happened in 2012.
Oh.
Yeah. So I was involved in that because the attacker was a member of the gang that I helped to start in 1988. So when that happened, and to this day, like I feel a responsibility. Like I feel an urgency to be a service to the Sikh community and to help them heal in any way that I can. And one of the greatest gifts I've gotten in my life was when Party told me that my friendship and brotherhood with him is a big part of his healing process. Like that's, to me, that was one of the greatest honors I've ever had. Party and I wrote a book together called The Gift of Our Wounds. And that experience is really amazing as well. But like, yeah, I wasn't arrested for that because I was long from the movement by the time that happened. Yeah.
You think the lack of social media made it easier for you to walk away and distance yourself?
Yeah, good point. It definitely did. And it's interesting how that works like across the board. Because just thinking about bullying, like back when I was pro bully in my school days, it was in-person bullying. And nowadays, like if a kid's getting bullied, there's nowhere to go. Like you can't just physically distance yourself from a bully because you go home and throw your phone on and now they're bullying you online. It's a similar thing with when I left, for sure. I know there's a lot of guys I talk to now when they try to leave, even if they're able to like physically distance themselves from the group's still coming after them online. So yeah, it was absolutely easier because social media wasn't around back then. That's like that. I don't think I ever got that question. Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Another question that we have for someone from home is how can you get people who hate to shift their paradigm? I hope I said correctly. Paradigm.
Sure. So there's a lot of parallels between violent extremism and substance abuse. And one of them is, I say this as an alcoholic. Like if you talk to anybody who's quit drinking or quit drugs, there's a rock bottom moment. In 12-step programs, that's what they call it, rock bottom. If you go to an AA meeting and there's 50 people there, all 50 of those people have a story of their rock bottom moment. What made you quit drinking? I was drunk driving and I killed someone. I lost my job. My marriage went to hell. Everybody's gonna have that rock bottom moment that made them think, I can't do this anymore. I can't drink anymore, and I need help to stop. Violent extremism is the same way. Every former I've ever met has a rock bottom moment that opened their eyes and made them think like they can't keep doing this. For me, it was that combined becoming a single parent and my other friend getting shot and killed. I have other friends, my buddy Movie, who I talked about, he stopped being a Muslim supremacist after 9/11. He was like, that's not what I signed up for. I don't think those people deserve to die. So because of that, there is an element of like, you can't help someone until they understand they have a problem. Which sucks kind of. It's not a great answer because it's hard to, it tends to be a less acute disease than a substance abuse issue is. But what a good way to introduce that possibility is by storytelling. So when I started out doing this, I went through all sorts of scenarios and I'm like, how can I do this and not be a public figure? Like, I don't want people to recognize me. I don't want to be on CNN. I don't want to do any of that kind of stuff. And the fact is, like, you have to. It's a part of a necessary evil to be in this field and be doing this work. So nowadays, I tell people I'm like, there's A-list celebrities. I'm like an F-list celebrity. I got recognized at a restaurant in Oslo, Norway once, at a place in New York and here and there. But to me, it's a necessary evil because the more my story is out there and on the bigger platforms, the more likely people who need to see it are going to see it. So like somebody who's in a hate group and kind of like they're feeling exhausted, but they're not really thinking about leaving at this point. But then they see a news story about a guy who did leave. And he's actually leading a pretty great life now. Wow, that guy actually looks happy. Like, I want to be happy. I do. So now the gears start turning. And you're creating a scenario where that rock bottom moment is more likely to happen. And again, it's the same with substance abuse. If you hang out with nothing but a bunch of hardcore partying people, and you're not exposed to anything else, like how do you know that there's a whole life after alcohol, and it can actually be a lot more amazing than life with alcohol? So it's introducing that possibility is really important. And then again, weaponized compassion, weaponized kindness. It's actually a psychological condition called a non-complimentary response. So if I come like storming into this room and you guys are in here and I'm like, rah, 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 being super hostile and angry, and you guys jump up and you're like, tell this guy, rah, rah, and you come at me with all your more hostility and anger, like that's a complimentary response. You're completing what I'm beginning. If I come in here screaming and let's fight, and somebody gets up like, hey dude, you look like you need a hug. Come here, come on, come give me a hug. That's a non-complimentary response. And because it's not expected, it's not what I'm expecting at all. And it's gonna jar me to the point where like, whoa, now you're having a cognitive opening because of that non-complimentary response. So those are the ways that the paradigm can be changed. And I know this is possible because it happened for me, and I like my job now is to facilitate that happening for other people. We made this jump.
It seems like your experience as a white nationalist, former white nationalist, kind of sort of peaked at, and it sort of peaked at the most violent that they would ever get, and then through a series of now fortunate events, kind of ran its course naturally to a point where it was no longer, you described it as no longer being able to sustain it.
Right.
Now the question is, and I think the interesting question is what exactly separates the person that has works to be run naturally,
okay,
or the person where it just continues to skyrocket until you become the person that shoots up once. So I guess what separates your experience from that experience, and how do we bring it down?
I love that. I don't think I got that question before either. You guys are killing it tonight. My first part of the answer is understanding that we were talking about this at dinner earlier. there's all sorts of really crazy dichotomies in being a human being. And one of them is that we all have a very common experience. We all, I don't care what anybody says, we all have like a deep innate desire to experience love in our lives. And if we don't, like all sorts of bad things can happen because of that. We all want to be happy. We all want to be successful. If we have kids, we want those kids to be happy and successful. Like there's all sorts of commonality. And at the same time, every single one of us is a unique individual. There's 8 billion some people on this planet, and no two are carbon copies. Even if they're identical twins growing up in the same house, they're not the same people. So we're unique individuals having a common experience, which makes that question like difficult to be boom, you're the quantitative answer. In my case, it's always a combination of nature and nurture. Like I was shaped by my experiences. At the same time, my experiences would have shaped someone else differently who didn't have the same personality type that I have. I think what worked in my favor is I've always been very curious. My love for like sports, music, TV, for culture, that was another thing that like had created some cognitive openness. For people who aren't interested in those things or aren't interested in much, they're like, they get fixated on one of these violent extremist ideologies. It is much harder to derail them. And also another interesting thing that there's a lot of, in fact, I don't want to say there's too many, but like being in the work that I do, like I've lost count of how many PhD students. I'm sorry, if anybody here's a PhD student writing a dissertation. Hey, can I interview you for my PhD? I'm like, okay, great. This is interview 100 for a PhD designation. But there's academics I've talked to, like New Wade Page, and they said Wade was not like the firebrand, like leader of the group. He was the wallflower. So like, well, you know, the firebrand's like, rah, 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 these guys, the guys out there being the figurehead and doing all the talking. Wade Page is just sitting back there like he's on the margins of this marginalized group. Whereas the people who are really active in the group, and while they're doing all sorts of harm, the interaction they have within the group is going to make them less likely to go out and shoot up a place. It's the lone wolf type, the people who are still feeling lonely and left out, even when they're connecting in their little, you know, hate cocoon, that are going to be more likely to commit these really horrific acts of violence. And if we study all these horrible hate crimes that's happened, the Christchurch shooter, this guy in Buffalo who read the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter, who read the manifesto of Anders Breivik, who killed 69 people in Utøya in Norway. They tend to be the more loner type people. So I think that's a big factor is that disconnect. Like the more a person's able to disconnect from the world around them, the more likely and the more able they become to commit like really horrific acts of violence. So I think in a broad sense, my prescription for that kind of thing is I think in education, especially early childhood education, I'm a huge fan of socio-emotional learning. I think we need to spend a lot more time teaching kids like how to feel, like how to connect with their feelings and how to think more than what to think. Teach them the character development of socio-emotional skills that they need to be a thriving, happy, healthy human being. And I think if we could do that at scale, it would definitely make a difference. Beyond that, I'm a bit biased, I'm a Buddhist, but the Dalai Lama said something to the effect of, if we taught every child to meditate, if we taught every 8-year-old on this planet how to meditate, we would have world peace within a generation. Now, as someone with a meditation practice, and as someone who's with meditation is really like she enabled me to do all this by really working on my own inner peace on a daily basis. I know if everyone did that, we would be in much better shape. The reason why this violence happens is because there's no inner peace whatsoever. There's nothing but turmoil inside a person. And if we can sit down and just be like, I kid you guys not, when I sit down to meditate, I'm like, I'm breathing. Oh, it's so awesome to breathe. There's my breath. I love my breath. And it sounds ridiculous, but when you can like be all stoked about just breathing, it's really transformational. And it's actually an easy thing to teach and an easy thing to practice that can address all these issues that we're talking about. You had a question.
Yeah, I think there's no one there.
Oh, sure.
Well, so do you think it's like a lack of validation, especially the people on the fringes have, and like potentially also just like really fragile egos, and they're looking for, oh, let me do this one big thing and then I'll kill myself. And then how do you create a sense of community where they get validation before they get to that point? Because if you can do it earlier, obviously it'll be easier for people to accept them. Because
right.
I'm sure it wasn't easy for you. Like the people who were nice to you, that's great. But like, most people,
oh yeah,
if you can find it in between, that would be a lot easier.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. I think first of all, understanding trauma is and the role of trauma in this behavior, and then just bearing witness to that trauma. That's what compassion is. Like compassion, the word gets thrown around quite a bit. I think not everybody throwing the word around really understands it. And that compassion is bearing witness to suffering without judgment, without an agenda, without prescription, just saying like, hey, I'm here and I see you and I'm here for you and I'm gonna listen to you. Rather than like trying to change the way they are. You kind of gotta like listen to all kinds of things you don't want to hear, but in the process of that listening, you're making that connection with the person that they haven't had with anyone else. I hope that my greatest success story in these 13 years of work is there's a gentleman named Chris Buckley, who I helped to get out of the Ku Klux Klan. Chris now works full time for Beards for Peace, getting people out of hate groups. But one thing Chris said, he said, Arno was the first person who treated me with compassion that like didn't feel obligated to give it to me. It was just unconditional and it was just there. So you really have to create the situation where there aren't any hoops to jump through, where you're meeting people where they're at and you're like, hey man, I'm here, I'm connecting with you. It's absolutely not productive to ever try to butt heads on issues because people are gonna be like, well, they're, the southern border of the United States and Hillary Clinton's child rape Pizza Hut, like what, all kinds of crazy stuff. And you're like, if you try like refuting these obviously cockamamie ideas, then they're just gonna dig in and there's gonna be no connection between you and them. Whereas if you just listen to them and when they're espousing all these like macro issues about things happening elsewhere in the world, a really constructive technique is to ask them, say, well, yeah, I understand you're concerned about the southern border of the United States. Have you ever been there? Like, have you ever had any firsthand experience that is like driving these strong feelings that you have? And they might say, yeah, I lived in El Paso for 20 years. Like, okay, then let's talk about what happened to them then. Keep bringing it back to their personal experience rather than whatever kind of crazy information they're getting from the backwaters of the internet. And what ends up happening is you're basically leading them into therapy. When they're talking about their personal experiences that shape their beliefs, that's therapy. And so that's validating for them to go through that process. And quite often, no one's ever sat and listened to them like that before, because all they're used to is like just animosity and button heads and all the liberals, like socialists, and capitalists, blah, blah, blah. Make it about them as a person and connect with them as an individual. And once you kind of can establish that, what I always do is I'm like, dude, I've lived your life for 7 years. I know everything you got to say. I've said it a million times myself. Like, come live my life for a day. Like, come, let's go all the places you're terrified to go, and I'll show you that it's actually beautiful. And there's a much better way to live your life. And you don't have to be a former in order to do that. You could just be a person who just showing somebody else what it's like when you're not terrified of the rest of the world, and showing the beauty of the world to someone who's refused to see it for so long. Those are things that everybody can do. So it really does, it boils down to listening, and it sucks. Like, it's not easy to do. By all means, we got to maintain our own self-care and well-being. And when you're getting burned out, like, go do whatever self-care things you got to do to keep yourself together. But when we do support each other and we're able to get out there and make those kind of connections, and we can change people. And that's pretty much the process how it works. Yeah. Oh, okay, sure.
It was pretty much the same question that I had, but more. First of all, thanks for the talk, being like so open about everything.
Sure.
One thing that I'm like always like stumbling upon is why like the Jews, like how we get from okay, someone was mean to me, like has to be the Jews.
Right.
Like why do you see that everywhere? Like how did that happen to you? And
Well, so as I mentioned earlier, anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred on the planet. It's for thousands of years, there has been targeted hate directed at Jews. And it's become like a self-fulfilling prophecy. 1,000 years ago, Jews are blamed for the Black Plague. And they're driven out of an area of Europe or whatever, and they end up going wherever they can go. So they show up and they're the strangers, and nobody knows about them. Something goes wrong there. Okay, whose fault is it then? It must be these weird people who just showed up, because it's not going to be our fault. So we as a human society have habitualized anti-Semitism for thousands of years, to the point where Jews have been blamed for everything from the Black Plague to COVID and everything in between. Famines, wars, droughts, all acts of God. It's always easier to point fingers at a group that you can say that's not us, that's them. And then I think because of, and obviously I'm not Jewish, so by any means, Jews correct me if I'm wrong in any of this. But I think that thousands of years of hatred being directed at a culture and a religion, it affects that culture and religion. So you look out for each other, you take care of each other, and you do have a tendency to become more insular. I know when the shooting happened at the Gurdwara, Party brought me there very shortly after to speak. And there's a lot of people at the Gurdwara like, we don't want any more tattooed white dudes here. Like, we get them out of here. And Party's like, we can't just sit in our pain. We can't close the doors, and we can't shut ourselves in. We can't be insular. That's what he's trying to make happen. And I don't think that's happened at large in the Jewish community, but I imagine when for thousands of years you're constantly a target, you're constantly hated. It's just a natural survival mechanism. Okay, well, we're just gonna take care of our stuff here and do whatever we got to do to survive, and you end up kind of shying away from connecting with other people. So the bottom line is there's no valid reason for it. If you ask me like why blame Jews, like there's no, oh, well, this is why. There's nothing I'm gonna tell you it's gonna make sense. But it's has been and remains to be, as evidenced by our guy Ye, and whoever else is going to come next with some ridiculous anti-Semitic comment. It's an easy scapegoat for whatever's going wrong in your life. Is the blame on Jewish people. That's been done for forever, and that's why it's so tragic. And I think that's why we as a society would have to really be as vigilant as we can and not tolerate anti-Semitism. And again, by not tolerating it, there are times when I see anti-Semites and I want to go like old school Arnold. Like that, I do have that part of me is still in there where I want to go like blast people who don't like Jews. But I know I'm not going to like beat the anti-Semitism out of them. And plus I have post-production syndrome, but it's the same dynamics that apply. It's like you need to love the anti-Semitism out of them, and you can do that without approving them. And in fact, I think that's one of the biggest contradictions, or the biggest ways to demonstrate what a contradiction it is to say, like, I wrote an op-ed about the whole Kanye thing. And I was kind of lagging on it. Of course, as soon as I'm ready to publish it, this guy attacks Pelosi, and then the election comes up, and I'm like, news cycle, gone, like nobody's going to read this op-ed right now. But in the op-ed, I talked about how it's a pattern for human beings for a very long time to blame what is wrong in their lives on Jews. And they do that because it's easier than looking inward and fixing whatever the problem is in your life that is the real root of that problem. It's just, it's an easy way to be like, oh, not my fault, it's the Jews' fault. And it's incredibly self-destructive on top of obviously doing a lot of harm to Jewish people, but it's very self-destructive for the anti-Semite as well. And I think that's an important point to make. I think in the fight against anti-Semitism is that it's not healthy for the practitioner of it. And I think the more we can establish that through storytelling and through like having community with people outside of our religious groups or ethnic groups, whatever, I think we can definitely get some traction.
Thanks.
Sure. Yes.
So in recent years, I know that there has been movement to like kind of like require classes for younger kids that promote diversity and inclusion. Do you think that if you had been exposed to this at a young age, it would have like, you know, been beneficial? Or do you think that there was so much like pain in your life that it would have done?
As I mentioned earlier, I think it's so much more important to learn how to think than what to think. And I am all for DEI across the board. Like, I love diversity like only someone who willfully deprived himself of it for 7 years can. I do a lot of DEI work, but I think a big mistake in this field is just to be like, okay, well, this is what everybody has to think. They're telling people what to think rather than how to think. And for me, the way I'm wired, if that would have been me as a kid, I would have been like, ding, like it wouldn't. I don't think it would have done a whole lot of good. In fact, it probably would have pushed me the other way. When a question I get quite often is, what would have been the best intervention for me? Hal, you were talking earlier how you had the boxing nonprofit. Martial arts is like works wonders. As a young boy, I had this like absolute obsession with martial arts and Bruce Lee and kung fu movies and whatnot. And my parents were too poor to like send me to take martial arts. There was one summer between 3rd and 4th grade where they found a judo program through the rec department, and they scraped up like $75 to put me in a 6-week judo program. And my sensei was this woman who was an Olympic judokan, and she was pretty small in stature. And the class was like kids and adults. And this woman was taking dudes like my size and just going like, kapow, like just whipping them on their ass. And I'm like, oh. And I was so stoked for judo already. I go to judo and I'd be sitting there like just waiting for her direction. When no other adult in the world could like tell me what to do, I was just like, I was all about just being like directed by this brilliant sensei. And so martial arts is a really excellent outlet for these like testosterone overloads that us men are so susceptible to. And I think it's an excellent diversion. And again, they definitely teach you what to think in martial arts. And in good martial arts, it is as much mental as it is physical. And ideally it's spiritual as well. Kung Fu actually originated in Buddhist temples. So I think going back to your question, I think spirituality is much more important than politics for any human being of any age. And I think, and wholeheartedly agreeing in a secular society, I don't think we should like pick any particular spiritual practice and be like, oh, this is what kids are going to learn. But just spirituality in the sense of the noble human qualities of forgiveness and compassion and kindness and gratitude. If we teach those things to children, that is going to go much farther to eliminate bullying of kids with gender dysphoria than it is to just be like, no, this is wrong, this is right, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. Because there's always going to be kids like me who, the more you tell them it's wrong, they're just going to be like, oh yeah, well, that's what I'm going to do then. There's a very, like, I think, deep-seated need to rebel that a lot of kids have. And that's why a lot of people are like, well, were your parents racist? I think if my parents were racist, it would have guaranteed I would not have been. Like that's the kind of kid I was. There's a lot of kids out there like that. So rather than like kind of keying off the political issues and coming from a political space, I think it's much more productive to come from a spiritual space. And put some martial arts in there too, and all better. Sure. All right, well, it's.
Do we have time for one where there's a question
Sure.
that came in from our online
Awesome,
audience?
awesome. Absolutely.
Oh. Right, so I guess we asked them all. Okay.
Did we? Okay.
Yeah.
So speaking of social media, the only one I do is Instagram. It's Arno Michaelis, ARNO MICHAELIS. It's like Michael, but with an IS instead of Michael IS. Arno, ARNO, Michael IS.
We will also email everyone who signed in to make sure that they have their social media and like links to our.
Awesome. Yeah, feel free to connect with me on Instagram. My story feed is all going to be Seinfeld stuff, cat stuff, shark stuff, and Yuval Noah Harari stuff, and just be prepared for that. But I'm happy to connect with anybody. I love staying in touch. If you got a question you didn't feel comfortable asking in front of the group, I'm happy to answer questions on Instagram. And if I know it's getting late, it's up. I'm here for the evening. If you guys still want to do a compassion workshop, I'm happy to conduct it. I think it's audience calls, but I don't know how much they're going to kick us out of that space.
I think we have it till as long as we want it. So, yeah, folks want to stick around and do a little more work together?
It's up to
Folks,
you.
it's up to you. Yeah, how many people do you need to?
I think so. Let me just describe the workshop, and you guys can decide if you want to hang out for it or not. So what I'm going to do is take everybody who's participating. We're going to randomize